G'day guys, it's Paul from Polyman Astro, and in today's rather lengthy and in-depth video, we're going to look at how to process this Lagoon Nebula data of mine. No longer are we just going to accept base settings in a simplistic way like we have in the past, because we've got enough videos under our belt now where we can actually look deeper and explain why we're choosing some of the settings we do and how to use the tools that we have for feedback on when we've made appropriate choices. And if you stick around, I'm going to show you a trick in GHS that you have not seen anywhere else, I guarantee that. And it's to do with working with the black point of your data without clipping it. Anyway, let's dive in. So as I said in the opening of the video, the first thing I did was open up Blink and run through looking for street stars. And it turns out early in the morning, the system got so low that it started imaging my fence line. So I got rid of those as well. No point sending bad data into weighted batch pre-processing. Sure, it'll probably deal with it, but it saves me time in the long run. And once I'd finished with weighted batch pre-processing, I ended up with these three images here. You noticed I chose 2x drizzle just as an experiment to see whether it would make a difference on my data at an imaging scale of 1.4. And I think it did. So maybe with good data in the future, I'll probably use drizzle. So let's open up my linear processing icon sets. And again, I've got a video on how I use the Stream Deck to do this with just a single button. It opens up that icon set for me. And we'll use the STF so we can actually see our first look at the data. Okay, so these are all auto-cropped and aligned with each other. The great thing about weighted batch pre-processing. And you can see that I got the Triffid in there as well. So I got a second image out of this for free when I cropped into that area as well, which could be its own video in itself. And the first thing I noticed for this data, and I can see it right here in the sulfur data, is there's some fantastic structure in the sulfur data that I want to come across in the final image. So if I'm going to make a luminance, I'm not going to use just the HA image. I want some of that structure from the S2 image. And the easiest way to do that is to use image integration, which I've already got set up with my three images here. And I want to do it with no rejection, okay? And I may as well turn off the noise evaluation as well. It's already done that for the main integrations. I just want these three images added together into a single image, my luminance. So let's have a look. And I know it's going to be hard with the STF to see, but that information from the S2 data is now there. So let's call this Lum. The stars are probably less tight than they were, but that's all right. We're going to remove them and put them back later anyway. So that's not a big issue. So let's go through before we go too far and rename some of these files, because they come out of weighted batch pre-processing with quite long names. So that's S2. This one is HA. And this one's O3. So now I've got nice names for everything, including the luminance. And we'll just minimize these out of the way. And you see I've already set them up so they pop down into the bottom corner here. We're going to start working on luminance first. So the first thing I did was open up DBE and run this. In most of my videos, I just show you a really quick, chuck some values in here, put some points around, and away we go. I don't take much time on it on my videos because I want to keep things simple for the earlier videos that I've done. But now that we have some really good quality data and we've got a fair few videos under our belt, it's probably time to spend a bit more time on DBE, and it's probably most illustrative with good data. So just as always, we're going to go around the image and put some points in where we think that there is some background sky, true sky background. So I think these are probably some good points in here looking at it. Hopefully it comes across on YouTube that you can see that these look to be roughly sky background for a good initial pass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this, and notice I haven't discarded the background model or anything like that, but I have set it to subtraction. I'm going to run this and just see what things look like. And I'm going to spend the time looking at the background model. So let's have a look at this. And the 24-bit option here for the screen transfer function is very useful here to smooth things out. So we can see that doesn't look too bad. I mean, what we're looking for is a gradient, smooth gradient across the image that would, something that would make sense as light pollution. We've already dealt with the vignetting with flats, so it shouldn't see any of that. The issue is I can see this dark band here, and that perhaps this section here is a bit brighter than the other section. So that's suggesting that we've chosen some points that are less than optimal, and we might need to adjust some of the settings here as well. So this point here I can see, looking at the image, I mean, let's close these down now, because we'll redo them. But it was this section here, and I can see, looking at it, there's a star field here. So they were a bad choice. So let's get rid of those points. I mean, especially this one here. Sometimes it's hard to grab them. Let's get rid of those, and we'll run it again. We'll look at the background and put it to 24-bit mode to make it smooth. And you can see that that section's much nicer now. But if anything, it's a bit darker than here. And we've still got this dark band running through here, which if you look, kind of makes it looks like there's maybe a dark band of dust running through here. So maybe that's not a good choice for points. So we should probably remove those points. So the background model is fantastic feedback telling you that you've maybe made some bad choices. And we'll leave them there for the moment. I sense that this might be a bad choice too, actually. So let's get rid of that now. And we'll run it again. 24-bit mode. Look at the background model. So it's already much, much smoother, but now we've got a bit of vignetting in the corners that we're going to have to deal with. And if things start getting a bit too dark, then you can start playing with some of the relaxation bits here. And View into Space did a good demonstration of this in one of his videos, and of course Adam Block did as well. And you can actually look through your points here and see if there's anything amiss. So that might be a bit of a star, so we could move that point away from a star if we wanted to. This one here, it's probably too close to a star. So I can move it around a bit. And you can go through and make sure things are fixed up. And if things are too bright or too dark in here, then that's where your shadow relaxation, smoothing factors, and tolerances all come in. But so this isn't a 100-hour video. Let me show you the actual DBE that I used on my image. Now that we've got a sense of how we can use that background model and the preview here to help assess things. So I'll close that down, and I'll open up my DBE icons, and you'll see there was a different one for 03. So if I open up HA now, these are the values I went with. So you can see I only have data in this top corner. I have a single value in the bottom corner, and I have a couple of values up here in the top corner. Nothing down here because there was just too much star field, and that's just a band of dark dust. It's not actual sky background. And as I said, I did very much adjust the shadow relaxations and the smoothing factors and so on to make that look a bit nicer. Once you're happy with the background model, so let's have a look at this background model. And you can see that's very smooth now. There is a gradient across the screen, and because that is true dust down the bottom there, you'd expect that to be a bit darker. So this does now look very smooth and very much like you'd expect to see of a light pollution background. So the model gives you feedback. Don't ignore it. Take your time. And once you're happy with it, then you can set up this discard background model and replace your target image. I mean, you don't have to do that. You can have a new DBE if you wanted to. And I always drag that icon off so I can use it. Okay. I'm going to close that down. rerun the screen transfer function. You can see now that there's more contrast. The background looks a lot smoother, like we'd expect. Okay, and I had a different one for O3, and that's because the O3 is more affected by light pollution. So I did need to add a few more points around, or delete a few points around, to make things work a bit nicer. And again, once you're happy with it, you can discard the background model and replace the image. Reapply the screen transfer function. Okay, and then S2, I actually did apply the HA background to it as well. So we'll run it on HA here. And then S2, I ran HA on that one as well. But I found that it didn't work so nicely on O3, so I had to create a different DBE for it. And you might find that you've got to play with it. So we're at the point now with our processing where we're not just going to accept default values for things. We've actually got to use what we've got and use the feedback it gives us to think things through. So now that we've done DBE, the next thing that I'm going to work on is Blur Exterminator. And I'm only going to run Blur Exterminator on the Luminance data. I'm not going to run it on the 3 other channels because I'm only going to use them for the color information. It's the Luminance where all the details coming from. If you wanted to run it on these, then I guess you could run channel combination and put them as a color image, run Blur Exterminator, and then separate the channels again. I suppose if you did it that way, you could also run SPCC if you wanted to get the colors right and then Blur Exterminator. It's up to you. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to run Blur Exterminator on the Luminance. And I've found good settings for me. Well, it depends on the image and my data, but I found I could sharpen this one quite decently because the signal to noise ratio is pretty good. And I wanted to do a bit of star sharpening, but not a heap. So if I run this, I might even run non-stellar before stellar here and just see how things go. Okay, so Blur Exterminator is done. Let's make this image a bit larger and we can do a before and after. So you can see it has tightened up the stars and it has done a little bit in terms of dealing with that atmospheric disturbance. It's a little bit sharper, I guess is the word. So that's done. Blur Exterminator is done. The next thing I run is Noise Exterminator, and then we'll run some Star Exterminator. And well, actually in this case, I might run Star Exterminator first and then Noise Exterminator. And the reason is that Noise Exterminator can have some issues with the stars if I want to crank up the detail slider here a little bit. So I'll remove those stars first and then we'll do that. So I'll just use my default settings, generate star image. All right, so that's Star Exterminator done. Minimize that out the way. I'm going to leave some space there because I'm going to put some stars down here in a minute. And now we can run Noise Exterminator. So I find for me around the 0.7, 0.75 is good for the linear. I don't want to push it too hard. And I can crank up the detail slider a fair bit for my data. But you've got to look at it when you're finished and make sure it hasn't done anything crazy, because the last thing you want to do is turn this into Topaz denoise and have it create data that doesn't exist. So let's run that. Okay, so if we zoom in here at that kind of central region, have a look around here for instance, then we can see it's subtle, but it has had an impact. And again, what you want to make sure is it doesn't add structure here in the darker areas that doesn't exist, for instance, which is something that Topaz denoise most definitely does do. Okay, so that's looking pretty good now at this point for the linear processing of the luminance. We'll quickly go through and do some linear processing on the color data, and about all I'm going to do for that is remove the stars and do noise exterminator. So we'll go through that quickly now. So there's the stars removed. Now we'll do noise exterminator, and for the color data, I do actually hit it with the defaults because I tend with color data I want it to be nice and smooth. I only want the color. I don't care about the detail. So that's the linear processing done. At this point, I might save this data. And the great thing about having these icon sets already saved is I don't need to add them to the project file. So we better save this project because we don't want to lose it. So I might save it on my D drive under Astro. Let's save it under YouTube here so I can see it. And we'll call it Lagoon. So that's the linear processing done. Now we can jump into the non-linear processing. So now we're ready to start stretching. So I'll open up my non-linear icon set. And you can see it includes GHS, range selection, curves, LHE, and some sharpening. And it'll remember some of the settings that I use as default, which is nice. So let's open up GHS to start with. And zoom in. Whoops, let's get out of log view. I'm going to choose a symmetry point somewhere off here to the right and send it. And then we can start stretching. And the idea is I want to stretch until I see a reasonable kind of background level. So I just need to adjust my windows here. I've got a bit of an error issue where this bottom disappears for some stupid reason. And I want my background to be about towards the end, about 0.9. So probably that was a bit of an extreme stretch. Maybe somewhere around here. There goes that window again. Yep, that's about 0.11. That's looking like a pretty good step. But you can see it's blown out. It's blown out the core, and I don't want that. So normally, I've told you in the past, let's just run local intensity at about 10 to control that core. But you can see it comes out quite flat. So this is a hugely dynamic range object, maybe not so much as M42, but it does have a high dynamic range. So just blindly using a local intensity here of 10 has overly flattened the image, and I want to maintain some of that dynamic range. I don't want it to have just disappeared. So we're at the point now, like I said, we've got some plenty of videos under our belt. We can start being a bit more advanced here and using the feedback from some of these tools to help us out rather than just selecting defaults. And of course, Adam Block did a video on just this kind of case recently, a fantastic video. And he does exactly this same thing of actually playing with this local intensity value. So let's start it at 0. So we've worked on a symmetry point which was roughly in the right spot. We've stretched so that that background looks pretty much where we want. And now we can just start sliding this local intensity. And you can see that that core starts being protected. But if I push too far, then it just flattens out. So I want to move the local intensity just far enough where I've got some structure in the core, but I haven't moved it to the point where it's just flat. So I do want to actually have some dynamic range maintained. So you can basically start playing around with the stretch factor a little bit and the local intensity a little bit to get it where you kind of would like it. The other thing is that once you've kind of got that kind of region where you wanted it, the dynamic range is still apparent, but you've controlled that central point. You might find that the background's moved from where you want it again, so you can play around with this symmetry point a little bit down here with the fine adjustment slider to get that background back where you wanted it to be. Okay, so in fact, I've actually set up a, I've already got the GHS that I used in a process container here because I did quite a few. So let's look at that first one, and I'll minimize this process container out the way. So let's look at this first one, and you can see it's pretty close to the values that I just used there, that I had a symmetry point of 3.3 and that's 3.28, and the stretch factor of 7.1 was pretty close to the 6.9 or whatever we had. And you can see what I was talking about, that we've set up the stretch so that background's about where we want it to be. I think it's about 0.9, 0.10 here. And we've got that we've still got dynamic range. We can still see that the heart of the nebula is brighter than this region down here, but I've still got structure in the core. So that's precisely what I want. So let's run that stretch and zoom into that core region, and you can see what I'm talking about. We've got structure in the core. It's not blown out, but it is brighter than the other nebulosity, which is what we want. And then all I start doing from this point is I start probably working more in log view than in the standard view from this point, because log view gives us a better overview of the actual histogram. And what we want is we want a nice smooth downwards transition here. That's what we're aiming for. So any humps that are in the data, it's your job now to try and start working with your stretch and your intensity. Again, trying not to blow things out too much and moving your symmetry point where that hump is, so that you can flatten those humps out and make this a nice smooth transition downwards. And sometimes that means you've actually got to move the local intensity into the negatives. So the symmetry point of 0.55 here, if I look at my image here, again, I've got to play with this because this silly bottom screen keeps disappearing. 0.55, this is 0.3, 0.4 in this region. 0.55, that looks like it's in this outer shell of the lagoon. So that's what I was aiming for. I'm trying to get some contrast into this outer shell, which is probably yeah, it is. Look at that. It's the outer shell of the trifid as well. So what I'm doing there, if we have a look, turn on and off the preview, is it's actually bringing some contrast into that region. That's what that stretch was all about. Okay, so I'll actually undo these stretches, and basically all I was doing with this process container was slowly working on, after the initial stretch and getting the background and controlling the core, it's just basically trying to work on that log view and get that curve. So if I open up GHS now, I've got a fairly smooth downward trend here in the log view, which is precisely what I wanted. And you can see the core is brighter than the other nebulosity, because I still want that to be apparent that it is brighter, but I've got some nice contrast in the darker nebula as well. And that core is not blown out. If I bring that window down here up again, that core is not blown out. It's close though. It's at about 0.96, 0.95. And I've got some nice contrast in the trifid as well. So that's my GHS stretching done at that point. So now we're ready to do a bit more contrast enhancement, but only on selective areas, and we'll do some sharpening as well. So next tool I'm going to use is my range selection tool, and you can see it's already set up with a fuzziness and smoothness and screening, and you can see it's not choosing that nearly blown out core. But I want to do more than this. I want to really zero in on just the brightest points of this nebulosity. In fact, I might even make it more smooth and a bit more fuzzy. just to smooth it out a little bit. Is that maybe too extreme? Because I don't want any of this central region here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. That's just going to attack the brightest parts of the nebulosity. So we'll apply that mask, but then we won't show it. Okay, so now what we're going to do is apply some LHE to this. I like to start at about 80 for my pixel scale, and I usually run it at full amount, and then I can assess whether I want to drop that or not. Okay, so you can see the whole point of LHE is I want it to be subtle, and it's not subtle. You can clearly see that it's done something. So that's what it looked like, and that's what it looks like now. So that's too extreme. So let's drop that back. Let's try, I often drop it back to, not 3, 0.3 and reassess. Definitely more subtle, perhaps a bit too subtle. So let's kind of go the middle ground. Let's make it, say, 66%. We'll round it up. Or 2/3, 0.67 rounded up. Okay, how's that looking? Yeah, I mean, that's looking better. So I can definitely see it's done something, but it is still subtle. I mean, you can maybe say that's still too much, but we'll run with that. Okay, and then I like to run it, I don't know why I closed that. Then I like to run it at a higher kernel radius, more like 256 or 512. Again, I run it at full to assess, and then we can tone it down to taste. Okay, so again, that's way too extreme. Again, we want it to be subtle. So that's gone way too far. So this is one where I really think that somewhere around the 1/3 works nice. Let's see how that looks. So that's now a subtle adjustment. So that's the local histogram equalization done. I'm going to keep that mask on because now I'm going to do MLT sharpening. So if I open up MLT sharpening, it remembers some of the settings that I often use, although it looks like I put them in the wrong spot. So I don't want to sharpen the smaller scale. That's where all the noise still is. So I want this to be 0.2 here. And I probably want this to be, say, 0.2 or 0.1 here as well. So that I don't want to have any bias on it. And we'll run that and we'll see what that looks like. So we'll zoom in. In fact, let's look at this structure here and see what that looks like. So again, it's a subtle change. May even have been too much if I look at this section here. Yes, too much. That's to me, to my liking, that's too sharp. So let's back this larger scale one off. We'll halve it. Okay, and potentially that's still too much, but it is better. I think that looks more natural now. So that's the sharpening done. So at this point, we're pretty well done. We've stretched our image. We've added a little bit more local contrast and a little bit of sharpening. Okay, so all we really need to do now is put the stars back. So we better stretch those stars because we haven't stretched them yet. So I use GHS for that, and I use a local intensity of 15 to really control these really brighter stars here. Don't worry about a symmetry point. And I'll turn off the screen transfer function. And then I just stretch them to a point where I think they look quite nice and natural, which is probably maybe about there. Looks like it could be a good spot. Because I want them to be there, but I don't want them to be the stars of the show. Okay, but they need to be stretched enough so they look natural. So let's rename this as add stretch stars. Okay, then I'll pop that just here for a second. So yeah, I actually did stretch those stars, didn't I? So I'll do that to all of the stars images while we're here. So they're all stretched the same, just so they're ready to go for the future and I don't forget. Okay, so now I can add the stars. So if I'll do that with some pixel math, which I've already set up here. It's just take the image, $T, add the stars image, and since it's got the same name, lum_stars, it's $T_stars. The reason I'm using $T is that's going to work when I start working with these other images as well, because $T just stands for whatever the name of the image is. And then I've done a little bit of extra bit here. Because I didn't screen the stars, this just smooths off the stars when I add them back a little bit and just makes it look a little bit nicer than just straight adding them back. So there's our luminance done, ready to go. Okay, so now we need to start stretching the RGB data and combine that. So we'll start with HA. So we'll use GHS. Same deal, choose a point somewhere to the right here for our stretch. That looks like a good spot. And then start stretching. And again, we want to stretch it to a point where the background looks fairly decent. So maybe somewhere around there looks pretty good. And then we want to move that local intensity so that it controls that core nicely. Okay, so that looks like a pretty good spot to me for RGB. We don't have to be anywhere near as careful with this as we did with the luminance, because we're just after a decent stretch where that core is not blown out, so we can get some nice color across the entire image. What's going to be important is that we try and stretch the images similarly so that the backgrounds are about the same level and the luminosity is about the same kind of overall level as well, so that they blend nicely. So that's the HA at that point done. So I'll reset that. So we'll look at the O3 now. So we'll choose a symmetry point somewhere to the right there. That looks pretty good. Stretch it out till that background looks about where we want it to be. Maybe somewhere around there. Looks pretty good. Then bring in that local intensity till it's about right. That core's not blown out. But that background looks a bit too bright, so maybe we'll adjust this value to our liking, maybe something like that. Looks pretty good. So again, we don't have to be super careful. We're just giving it an idea that it's about the right spot. Actually, I'll close that for a second. Compared to the HA. The cores look similarly bright. The backgrounds look similar-ish at the moment. We'll fix that up in the next stage. And now we need to do the S2. So I'll open up GHS again, turn off that screen transfer function. So that looks pretty good. Pull that stretch up. So I've got that central region about where we want it. That looks pretty good. Again, I don't want to blow the core out, but I want to maintain some of that dynamic range. The background looks about right there. So let's run with that. And again, we can compare that to the HA. Looks pretty close, okay? That's pretty much where we want things to be. That's good. So now I'm going to do something that you won't have seen anywhere, not even in Adam Block's video on GHS. This is a trick that's come straight from David Payne, the creator of GHS himself, on how we can control that black point, refine that black point without clipping. Because if I use histogram transformation tool, or I use the linear option here in GHS, let's say I was working on this S2, if I want to bring that point, that edge of the histogram backwards, using the black point slider, then I actually clip data. You can see there's a clipping value here. I actually clip data. I actually lose some data. Whereas if I use David's little technique, then you compress the data. You won't actually clip it. So if I use a point to anywhere on the left of the histogram here as my SP value, and then I pull that highlight protection all the way back to that symmetry point, and I'll show you why in a second, and then I make sure that the stretch we're going to apply is very much centered and specific to this symmetry point. When I pull this stretch factor now, that pulls the slider back just as if I was trying to adjust that black point, but it will never actually clip the data. It just compresses it. So that's an advantage to doing this kind of method in GHS. And as David said, you don't actually have to keep your symmetry point here. You could pull the symmetry point right into the histogram here if you wanted to and pull it back, and you can see it never actually clips. It just compresses the data into that corner. So it's a really powerful little tool. And what I want to do is I want to compress this region here so that it gets a black point more similar to my HA here. The reason is when I combine these images, if the background level, which is essentially the sky peak, the peak of the histogram here, if that is aligned very nicely with the three images, then you're going to get that nice neutral sky background for free. So that's the first thing we want to do. Then we can worry about any other stretching we need to do to get the colors right. We need that background right first. So for the S2 image, I want this peak here to move towards where it is for the HA. So I need to find what that is. So that the HA is roughly around the 0.10, 0.12 mark by the looks of it here in the darkest regions, which probably aligns with where the peak is here. No, look at that. The histogram peak's around 0.12. So I want the S2 peak to move to about the 0.12 mark. So about there. That's where I want my symmetry point to move to. So it's probably, why not use that as the symmetry point? Make that local intensity 15, drag down this highlight protection. And I did say I was going to explain why I did that. So when I do this stretch, what's happening is anything to the right of that symmetry point is having a nice linear stretch applied to it. It's more extreme on the left here, and that's why it's compressing that data. So I can move this peak until it's pretty well lined up with the 0.12 that I wanted. And if I look at that now, it should look pretty similar in brightness to the HA. So now if I look at where that peak is, it's around the 0.12. The peak of the HA is around the 0.12. I can now do the same thing to my O3. I want the brightness to be about 0.12, so send that as the symmetry point. Local intensity of 15, pull down that highlight protection so that it's linear on the right of that, and then stretch just until that peak is roughly aligned with that symmetry point. So maybe about there. And if you need to refine that, you can choose the D slider here and move it left and right to better control that. And there we go. They now have backgrounds pretty much the same, which means when I combine them in a second, the background's going to have that correct kind of neutral grey colour that we're expecting. So now I'm going to run my Foraxx palette utility script. Let's open that up. And I'm going to run 3 channels because I've got S, H, and O. And I want to work on the stars as well. So let's use the S2, the HA, the O3, and then their stars, which we've already stretched earlier. and it's going to create a Foraxx image for me, and it's going to create a Foraxx stars image as well. Okay, so there's our Foraxx image created and a Foraxx stars, so I can minimize them down here. So here's our Foraxx image, nicely colored, ready to go. So again, we can use our PixInsight script to add those stars back. So $t plus $t underscore stars minus $t times $t underscore stars. So again, as I said, that here is just going to make those stars a bit smoother, and it's going to give them a bit nicer color as well, not risk blowing out the colors. And there we go. There's our RGB image. Now our Foraxx image, ready for final combination into an LRGB image. Okay, we're in the end stages now. So I've got my Foraxx image. We've got our Loom image. What I might actually do though is go back one step with the stars, and rather than apply the pixel math I did with the Luminance stars, I might try it with the HA stars because they're tighter, and see how that looks. We probably won't even notice a difference, but I'll use the HA stars instead. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to create the LRGB image, and then all we really need to do is crop. So open up LRGB, make sure your RGB channels are unticked because I only want to apply a luminance to it, and make sure you put the correct name here. So my luminance is lowercase l. All right. So quite a dramatic change if you have a look. If we previous and now, we've got all that detail from the luminosity coming through, but we've got all that beautiful color from the Foraxx image. So now we can, let's duplicate, and we'll call this one Lagoon, and I'll call this one Drift, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to crop them. So bring out the dynamic crop, and on the Lagoon, I think I cropped it roughly like this. Let's crop it here anyway. It doesn't have to be exactly like my final image. So there's the Lagoon cropped, and then we'll do the same thing for the Drift. Maybe not that far, maybe something like that. And there we go. So we've got our two final images to end with. We've got the Lagoon and we've got the Drift. So a rather detailed processing video, but I like to think that it's going to be beneficial. It's not just superficial anymore. I actually went through some of the detail with getting a good background model for your DBE. And I showed you a trick with GHS and compressing your backgrounds, which you won't have seen anywhere else. So if you've got some great quality narrowband data that you'd like to try this with, hopefully this processing workflow has been useful for you. Thanks for watching.